the parliamentary party does have confidence.
Government is making no deal preparations.
The judge finding that the president ordered and paid for Michael Cohen to commit a crime.
I will not be the villain of his story.
Trump did nothing wrong. I did nothing wrong.
This is the What and the Why podcast for the week ending the 14th of December, 2018.
Greetings. It was the whatever night it was before Christmas when all through the House of Commons something really important happened which didn't change anything. Also, Macron goes on the naughty step, the Americans go to Africa, Cohen goes to jail, the Russians play blackjack in Venezuela, and we might just whistle while we work. Welcome to the What and the Why podcast, episode 7, with the mouse murderer of the Northwest,
David Waywell.
David Waywell, and the boy least likely to who never really did, Tim Marshall. David, as you know, I don't care. How was your week?
It's been all right. My highlight has been listening to a load of punk music. I subscribed to the I got the 99p deal on Amazon for 3 months, so I've been going back through finding music I've never heard before, like Ian Jury and The Clash.
Yeah, nostalgia's not what it used to be, though, is it?
Well, it's not really nostalgia for me. I've never heard it before.
Well, I'm very, very surprised. I mean, I'm a couple of years older than you, but I was so surprised you weren't across the lyrical genius that was Ian Jury of Ian Jury and the Blockheads.
Yeah, Reasons to be Cheerful is my favourite song at the moment. I'm playing it continually. I probably need some...
And The Clash were the sort of sound of a generation, but perhaps it wasn't your generation, it was mine.
No, it was your generation. My generation was the horrific bloody Jason and Kylie and the New Romantics, Duran Duran and all that crap.
Talking about my generation. Name that song?
Oh, that's the Who?
That's right. Right, you have got an email to read out.
Oh yeah, we've had some emails this week, a few nice emails complimenting us on the podcast, but we've got one which includes a question for you. It's from Mark Ogden, senior football writer at ESPN. It doesn't say whether it's proper football or that American rugby thing. He said he's enjoying the podcast, especially after reading your books about flags, walls and geography.
That's nice, thank you.
Not my book about monks, I noticed, but there we go. Have you done anything, planning to do anything on Brexit? There's so much coverage out there, but so far I've been unable to find anything that cuts through the argument to present the state of play impartially to tell us exactly what's going on. So there you go.
Well, thanks. Thanks for the email. Thanks for the complimentary remarks. I gathered the entire newsroom together recently, which was basically a phone call to you, David. One of the reasons we haven't done much on Brexit is because everybody else is. But this email is different, and it seeks the why of Brexit. So I'll give that a go briefly. Well, I'll try to be brief. I would start with the fact that Britain is an island. The psychological impact of that is great on the national psyche. Also, it has genuinely protected the United Kingdom from invasion. The things that have roiled, as the Americans say, the continent for centuries, be it revolutions, fascism, communism, never really crossed the channel and took root here. And we've always sort of been quite glad about that and looked across at the continent. So that's a beginning. Then there's this glorious empire and perhaps a certain nostalgia of it, which is still in the national psyche. Move forward. After the Second World War, I'm not sure that the British, to this day, understand that the UK, despite the terrible suffering and loss of life, did not suffer at the magnitude of the suffering of continental Europe, neither in loss of life, smashing of the economy, and smashing of the infrastructure. And the shock of that drove the Europeans into each other's arms, notably the French and the Germans. Now fast forward to them making a success of that. The British economy is then going downhill in the 70s, and the British decide to join this organisation. So far, so good. But it never fully bought in the way that the other Europeans did. It was always slightly on the sidelines. What then happens is the economic community that we joined turned into very much a political union as well. The last thing is a confluence of events. Notably, in 2004, the East European countries are admitted, and freedom of movement means that because at that point the British economy was doing so well, a huge numbers of East Europeans came over to the United Kingdom to try and make their living. And let's face it, we needed them, and we still do need them. But the volume of people, and there are also people from elsewhere, has upset the equilibrium in many, many communities. So immigration is now a factor in this. Then we get the 2008 crash, mass migration in general from all over the world, the refugee crises, etc., etc. And this fissure that has always been in the United Kingdom comes to the fore. Prime Minister Cameron decides he will lance that boil. He is so confident that the British will vote to stay in, I don't think factoring in all the things I've just said. And so he puts it to the people, and at that point, 52% of them say, we want out. And so we're on the way out. Where we are now on Brexit is, according to which poll you look at, it is far more around the 50-50 mark, as the narrative of how dangerous it's going to be economically to leave is persuaded certain percentages of people and younger people, and of course there's more younger people coming into of voting age, and well, we are where we are now. I hope that's a relatively brief, but I hope it's a why the British, why it is such a huge debate here, bigger than it is elsewhere. Any of that you want to push back on or agree with?
I would add a few bits, because I think I do watch a lot of American television, and I watch a lot of the coverage of Brexit through American eyes, and I do notice that people like Piers Morgan push a certain narrative which I don't think fully explains what Brexit is about. So what I would add is, it's not just about immigration. Immigration has been a huge problem for 20 years, and the Leave vote was largely about immigration. However, what you don't also realise is it was coming at a time of after a lot of austerity. The government had done huge cutbacks.
Yes.
David Cameron was hugely unpopular in large areas of the country, and a lot of the vote was about Cameron rather than the issue of Brexit. There are people who admit they didn't know what they were voting for. They just wanted to give David Cameron a bloody nose because they never thought we would leave. The other thing,
and he stood for the elite, given that he's an old Etonian, etc. And there was, I agree with you, an absolute two fingers to the elite, a real screw you. You're saying this, I don't get whatever it is you say. I'm going to do the opposite. Yeah, there was that as well.
The other point, and I think this is a really key point to understand, because it's one of those oversimplifications which kind of pollutes the debate, is there's this talk about the elite and everybody else, the ordinary folk. And whenever you see the story of Brexit posed, especially in an American context by some of these pundits who go over to America, who are themselves part of the elite, they talk about it as though everybody who's in the elite wants to remain, and everybody else, people like me, people in small towns in the north of England want to leave. That's not the case at all. There's a lot of people who are working class in small towns who want to remain, and there are people like Boris Johnson who are part of the elite who actually want to leave. So it's not
many of them. James Dyson of the Dyson manufacturing giant, the guy who runs the Wetherspoons pub chain, Jacob Rees-Mogg, the poshest of the posh. I agree. It's not fair to portray a leaver as some sort of as some of them have been portrayed, thick working class racists, which is so insulting.
Well, there was one of the MPs stood up this week, one of the Leave MPs, I forget whether it was from Labour or Tories, I think it was a Tory, and he said, "How dare you? Are you ignoring me because I'm too northern?" Well, I'm northern and I'm being ignored because I'm a Remainer. So it doesn't really, it's not as simple as that. And one final point, the politics of this is also warped, as in, it's the Conservatives largely who want to leave, and Labour who are perceived, I mean, whether this is true in the case of Corbyn, we don't know. Labour, who are seen as wanted to remain. But there's a paradox here, or kind of something which doesn't add up. The Conservatives, being for free markets, really probably want immigration because they want the cheap labour, and it's Labour who really probably don't want immigration because it protects the working man's wage. So there's lots and lots of layers to this, and it's not always as simple as it's presented, as in this is a battle between. It is
not a left-wing, right-wing debate either. I mean, the whole left-right thing is pretty much out of date in most modern politics, but especially in this. I mean, there is an idea, if you vote Leave, you must be a right-winger, which is nonsense. Or if you're Leave, you must be.
There's a very, very good argument, and I think this is probably Corbyn's argument, but I don't think he wants to come out with it, that the left, and especially the harder left, do actually want us to leave because it suits their worldview against globalisation, etc.
Well, I think the hardest of the hard left also would welcome economic catastrophe, because they do believe, revolutionaries believe in destroying things in order to build them up, and that's how they can achieve it. Right. Well, look, again, thanks for the emails, and if anybody does want that type of approach to a story, because I am always more interested in the why. And obviously, everything David and I said could be completely wrong. No, everything he said could be completely wrong.
That's true.
Right. But also, on completely right, though, Macron. Briefly on Macron. Yes, I did predict that he would cave in. I was wrong because I thought he would do it within a week, and it took him 4 weeks.
Yeah. And what I would say is nothing proves that you're not part of the elite quite like sitting behind a gold table and telling the people that you're with them, is there?
Yes. After 4 weeks of finally realizing that everyone hates him, he decided to come down from Jupiter, because he said, "I will govern like Jupiter, above the fray." As you say, David, he sits behind this gold gilt-plated desk with all these baubles of office around him.
How tone deaf.
Yeah, and used the phrase he has used in the past of "my people." Excuse me, we only hired you. Well, the French only hired him for 5 years, maybe 10, but it's looking like 5 at the moment. Right, so briefly on the deal, he'd already frozen the increases on diesel. He's going to give €100, which is about £90 or $110 very roughly, onto the minimum wage. I mean, €25 a week. That's well worth having. A tax freeze for pensioners on low incomes, and no tax on overtime earnings to try and boost the economy. I think it will draw enough of the sting for it to dampen down, especially seeing as Christmas is coming.
Yeah. It's ruling like a Tory. This is what the Tories do every election time. Give us three years of austerity and then sort of great gifts in the budget pre the election. I mean, I think everyone.
Not everyone doesn't do austerity, but everybody does hold a little back and then give it the year before the election. Yeah. Venezuela again briefly.
Well, I was going to say one other point about Macron is the yellow vests are spreading, aren't they?
They are. I've seen it in Belgium, in Spain, Brazil.
Banned in Egypt.
Now, that's a really interesting one. I mean, this is a globalized story in this globalized age where, we all see what's going on in other parts of the world. And so the yellow jacket is now this symbol of standing up for your rights. But what's really interesting in Egypt is that a lot of stories have come out. The police are going around to shops saying, do not sell individual yellow jackets, only sell them to businesses that come with proper orders. And that tells you how frightened the Egyptian elite is of street protests.
Yeah. And the next story that's going to come out of Egypt is there's going to be a sudden rise in people getting crushed by lorries.
Sorry, I hadn't.
3, 2,
took me a couple of seconds. Thank you. Venezuela, again, fairly briefly. It's one of those stories that really lays open what's going on around the world. So Russia sends 2 bombers to Venezuela, Tu-160 bombers capable of carrying nuclear weapons, flew straight into Simon Bolivar Airport in the capital, Caracas. They weren't exactly hiding it. They're known by the Russians as white swans. NATO calls them blackjacks. So when you see here in the news that they scrambled the planes to intercept blackjacks, that's what they are. It has happened before, 2008, 2013, but timing is everything. And you know the timing of this?
Go on, I don't.
Maduro, the president, met Putin recently. Putin has agreed to invest lots of money in Venezuela, but the real bit of minuscule saber-rattling is that there is increasing talk in Latin America of potential military intervention in Venezuela by the neighbors, possibly Brazil, but with US backing. So in come the Russians flying 2 nuclear-capable jets, bombers into the airport to say, right, this is our new ally. Well, it's not a new ally, but this is our ally. Don't forget it. I don't think it would stop anybody doing it, but it is that sort of power play signalling which tells you what's going on in the world.
Yeah, it's Putin's judo, isn't it? He pushes wherever you're weak and he leaves you alone where you're strong.
That's a brief one. Another brief one, it's only because, just to sort of keep up with stuff we've talked about in the past, when we discussed the arrest of the deputy head of Huawei phone manufacturer in Canada at the behest of the USA, we did predict that there will be detentions back in China of Canadians or Americans, and what a surprise, 2 Canadians are now held in China. One on suspicion of engaging in activities that harm China's national security, and another one is a former Canadian diplomat. The first one, Michael Spavor, very interesting, does organise trips to North Korea. He's actually met Kim Jong-un, but I think they just went on a fishing trip. They've got to take somebody. They've taken him, and it'll be leverage for what happens to the deputy head in Canada.
Well, I don't know what to add to that. It's just definition of a simmering tension, isn't it? It's just...
Yeah. That was just a news update.
Yeah.
Africa, the continent of the future, as the Trump administration keeps calling it, then doing not very much. But this week, National Security Advisor John Bolton says they're going to get in there. They're going to have a new strategy to massively increase US investment and trade. Why? To counter Japan's growing influence. This is where I wanted to connect this to the previous story. The whole USA trying to get hold of Huawei's deputy head is actually about artificial intelligence, the 5G network, and Chinese espionage. And I think in Africa, there's a connection there, and it's with the rare earth minerals.
Yeah, it is. Semiconductors, the future of, the world. So,
can you explain that to me? Because, I know that they need the semiconductors, but I don't know enough about it. There's lots of semiconductors, aren't there? Chile and other places?
There are, but there's finite amounts of these resources. I don't quite know. I haven't got a map in front of me of where all the deposits are. But it's things like lithium as well. There's going to be a global shortage of lithium because once everybody moves over to electric cars, we're going to want lithium, and lithium's not that easy to get hold of.
Well, I think so some in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I'm not sure. Might even be some in Chad. But yeah, there is a lot of what people need in Africa, and the Chinese are going gangbusters.
But this has been going on for about... I remember watching a documentary about this and the gold trade in Africa, where the Chinese have just gone in and they're literally huge amounts of money, which is being translated into basically armed militias who are basically grabbing land, raping the soil. It's the sort of worst kind of strip mining, that's going on. And ordinary Africans have got no say in it. It's horrific what's been going on. So here actually, everybody's been critical of Bolton, and I've never been a fan of Bolton, but this seems to me something that's been long, it's long been needed.
Yeah, well, but they're not. They're doing it in the US interest, but
of course.
but they're saying that The 60 billion which they're going to put in will create jobs. Let's face it, nobody nowhere needs jobs as much as Africa. It's called the demographic tsunami. Population now around about 1.2 billion. Population in just 30 years to double to 2.5 billion. Half of them under the age of 24. Well, that's an awful lot of extra jobs you need. And
it's one of those issues where it's the John le Carré novels. All John le Carré novels sort of pose like the great other, which is either China or Russia, against like Western British American interests, and you just have to balance it. Who do you think is going to provide the best, safest outcome for the people stuck in the middle? I mean, you could be nihilistic about this and say neither side, but I think we probably have a little bit more.
Briefly on that, Bolton said that the Chinese and the Russians are deliberately and aggressively targeting their investments in the region to gain a competitive advantage over the United States. Well, yeah. Why shouldn't they? That's what people do.
We haven't got a great history, but we do also have a history of colonialism, which makes us a little bit more, how shall we say, reflective about how we approach these things. So maybe, hopefully, it's not going to be another Belgian Congo situation.
Well, some people call it a form of neo-colonialism.
Neo-colonialism, but
the Chinese do have, or economic colonialism. The Chinese do have this strategy where they lend money for massive projects, let's say a port in Sri Lanka, to the government of Sri Lanka, but with the strategy that they don't think that the government will be able to pay them back. And so a few years down the line, when the bill is to be paid, they say, well, we know you can't pay now, but okay, just give us the port. Lease it to us for 100 years. And they are replicating this in many parts of the world. Now, to something I know very little about. Michael Cohen went to jail this week, I believe.
Oh, God, yeah. I mean...
Well, in 100 words or fewer, please explain.
He's been caught committing...
Well, who is he, first of all?
Well, he's Trump's former attorney, but he's also basically Trump's fixer. He's Trump's muscle in the legal sense. He's been caught, or he's been punished for all Trump's sins of the past, especially around the election when he was channeling money to certain women to sort of hide their indiscretions with Trump.
Alleged indiscretions.
Well, no, they're no longer alleged, are they? I mean,
yes. Well, what, has he admitted them?
He's admitted doing the payments. I mean, you don't.
That's a different thing. That is a different thing.
Okay.
Maybe I've forgotten what his argument is. I think it's something along the lines of course I didn't do this, but I really can't be dealing with this right now, so here's several $100,000, now go away.
Yeah, sure. All right. But anyway, he's gone to prison for it. Federal Correctional Institute, Otisville, is going to be...
Well, why do we care?
3 years. Well, because he's going to have a lot of dirt on Trump. It's just part of the greater Mueller inquiry. He's been talking to Mueller for Christ knows how many hours, along with...
Sorry, who's Mueller?
The special counsel Mueller, who's currently investigating collusion, obstruction of justice, Robert Mueller, and all this information. I mean, the fact that there's so many people are admitting to guilt, and we're not actually hearing often what they're guilty of. There's a lot of redacted information. Suggests that Mueller is getting a pretty big case. Has got a pretty large case against Trump. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the new year. New Year's the key point because the Democrats will take over the House of Representatives, at which point they'll start to open investigations. Mueller will have a little bit of security in the sense of he'll have more power coming from the coming from Congress. You've also noticed, I mean, this is linking it a little bit. It does link to the Trump's this story, but it's a little bit separate. I noticed this week that the Senate has actually accused MBS of killing Khashoggi. They've actually voted not to support the Saudi war in Yemen. This is Republicans who must have voted here against Trump. So I think this is a narrative you're going to see playing out in the future. I think Trump is going to become increased. I mean, he's already a lame duck, but this is the next stage of the American cycle. I doubt if Trump will stand in 2020. I just think the things are mounting up against him so badly. He can't even get a chief a chief of staff, to replace
Well,
Kelly.
the investigation bores me until we get to crunch time, and the US headlines tell me every week, this is it, bombshell, it's crunch time, and it isn't. When it is crunch time, I will join you on the sofa with the popcorn. Until then...
But hang on. I understand. Yeah, the sense you want the ending, but things very, very rarely move that fast. These things. I mean, Watergate. I don't know. We think of Watergate as happening in the space of a 2-hour film with Robert Redford and what's his face. Dustin Hoffman. But how long did that take? So it's fascinating to follow it, and you can see it's kind of tracking the cycle of the presidency leading up to the 2020 elections. I find it fascinating.
Yeah, I'm actually probably too lazy. Now, in news to make your blood boil, in what is the world coming to news, a comedian has turned down a gig at a university after being asked to sign a behavioural agreement first. His name's Konstantin Kisin, Russian, been over here for 20 years. He was warned about a no-tolerance policy, and I was shocked to find that it was at the School of African and Oriental Studies, SOAS, as it's known, which is one of the most woke, as I believe you young people say, one of the most woke universities in the world. Mr. Kisin said, I'm not going to do this, because the contract said, this has been written to ensure an environment where joy, love, and acceptance is reciprocated by all. And the topics that he had to be very, very careful about were racism, sexism, classism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, or anti-religion or anti-atheism. Yeah. It does not mean that these topics cannot be discussed, David, but it must be done in a respectful and non-abusive way.
This is one of those quotes which I'm not sure I'm getting right, and I might be misattributing it, but Chaplin said something like, all humour is founded in cruelty, which I tend to agree with. There was a story early in the year, a cartoonist in America called, I think it's Jeff Danziger or something. He had to apologise because he'd drawn a picture of, he'd been accused of body shaming Sarah Huckabee Sanders because he'd drawn a, obviously quite round. I don't, even saying that, I think I'm going to get letters. This is. I mean, we were talking last week the fact I've started to cartoon again, and one of the reasons I did stop was I was struck earlier in the year by this horrible sense that I don't know how you can cartoon or caricature somebody without being cruel. If when I draw Boris Johnson, I have to draw him fat. I mean, how do I deny the reality of what I see? Or if I draw, Jacob
the word you're looking
Rees-Mogg,
for there was large, not fat.
Okay, large. I'm
even though he is fat.
Yeah,
I mean, he is fat, but you should have said larger.
Well, yeah, but this is where it all gets inside your head, isn't it? There's a comedian, one of the writers of Father Ted, is currently fighting a war on Twitter, Graham Linehan, about the trans movement and how transgender men are using the politics of gender in order to claim rights which women have taken centuries to fight and gain, such as the right to compete in certain sports. It gets inside your head. Twitter have been banning people who've been misusing the right pronoun, he instead of she or she instead of he. I don't know where this is leading. I wish I had an answer.
Well, I think it'll burn itself out, but it will be in flames, and it is very nasty. To their credit, the SOAS, it was a UNICEF children's charity gig, and they did say, look, we just wanted to make sure it was an appropriate event, and we apologise for the misunderstanding. But I'm not sure what the misunderstanding is. It clearly says, please make jokes about, if you have to make jokes about these things, please do them respectfully. But how? I think
this is one of those instances actually where the market will eventually have its the logic of the market will play out. If you decide to impose those kind of rules on comedians, when the comedians who are going to turn up are going to be frankly crap, and the audience is going to go somewhere where you're going to have 1970s style, Les Dawson, I mean, this is what happened with alternative comedy in the 80s. All the alternative comedians in the 80s, they started out saying we're not going to be like that, and every single one of them became another version of the 1970s comedians. Bottom started out pretending to be sort of parody and kind of arse jokes, and at the end they still end up making the same arse jokes as comedians have made for centuries. So it's ridiculous.
Yeah, and there is also this mindset that even for people that shout the loudest or are most woke,
I hate that phrase.
Will use words or would tell a joke about a gammon. A middle-aged man of a certain age with a very red face because he's very, very angry, who's white, and he's gammon. I mean, I don't like describing people as pieces of meat in a sort of racist manner, but this word is now widely used. But people don't. That's the problem with this whole argument, that sort of insult would be okay because it fits my worldview, says somebody.
Yeah, there's a story I noticed on Twitter the other day. I mean, Owen Jones is not somebody who I regularly read or agree with, but he'd said something like, Alan Sugar had said, if Corbyn wins,
he's going to leave the country.
He's going to leave the country. And Owen Jones said, oh, good riddance. As did a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And there was a huge backlash saying, you're saying that because he's Jewish. No, it had never occurred to me, actually, in a weird way, that Alan Sugar is Jewish. So,
I think there's a massive rise in anti-Semitism, especially on the left. However, I agree with you. When I saw that one, immediately people piled in and said, oh, you're trying to encourage Jews to leave the country. And on that particular occasion, by Mr. Jones, who I don't think has ever said anything as unpleasant as that. No, it was because he has a visceral dislike of the individual. On that occasion, I don't think it had anything to do with it. But we are in these heightenedly sensitive times.
Yeah, I mean, I just to make clear, the only reason I dislike Alan Sugar is I used to work in computer support, and he made Amstrad PCs, which were atrocious, and made my life a misery during the late 1980s. It was horrific.
Sorry, David, the comedian that said he wasn't going to do the gig, his quote, I think all this reflects an attitude amongst a group of people, particularly at university, particularly where it seems they've become places of indoctrination rather than learning.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, I'm going to tell a joke which you might be upset by.
Oh, definitely.
But I'm going to cover myself because I was reading an article, The Philosophy of a Controversial Joke, by an American woman who calls herself a philosopher, therefore she is, Isadora Mosh. Right, why can't Helen Keller drive? Because she's a woman. Right, you're laughing at someone who's blind and deaf.
Yeah, no, it's because it's the twist, isn't it? Because you're expected to say the reason you can't see. Because...
Well, she says humour arises from the intersection of two incompatible scripts. You're not expecting that. It is surely tongue-in-cheek that is the joke, that, you don't necessarily believe that women can't drive very well.
We are predisposed to humour, and we are predisposed. I think in our minds we already have a lot of these jokes, or the templates of these jokes already written in our nature in some deep, inexplicable way, and these jokes merely kind of reinforce the things that we already realise. I don't think you can kind of deprogram yourself out of having a comic frame of mind. That's why I think a lot of these arguments are silly, because things that are going to be funny now are still going to be funny in 200 years.
Well, they are, but there is a statute of limitation on humour. I wouldn't tell a Holocaust joke now, but if I came across a good joke from the sacking of Baghdad in the 1200s, where 40,000 people were murdered, every single person in the city was put to death by the Mongols, I think it was, that would be acceptable, wouldn't it?
Well, I was going to say that's different. What I'm talking about is like we have these patterns, we have these templates, we have this ability to put one thing against another and kind of see similarities and differences. All the things which make up humour, comedy, cartoons, which I obviously draw. All these things, I think they're the established mechanisms of humour are not going to change. Actually, what kind of subjects you put into those contexts, into those machines, into those frameworks, those things do change. Obviously, I mean,
Well, one of my favourites, with the statute of limitations apparently has run out, so you can tell it, is Abraham Lincoln's wife interviewed after the shooting. Yes, but apart from that, how was the play, Mrs. Lincoln? Right, almost finally. I don't know if you've seen this one. I came across it yesterday. The New York Times London correspondent was burgled a couple of months ago.
Oh, yeah.
And so she wrote this article yesterday up on the website and then said, have you experienced a petty crime in London? Click to tell us your story. Your submission may be selected for publication. And so far, more than 5,000 people have replied, including myself. But I don't think they're going to print any of them. You know why?
Go on.
Because the wonderful British sense of humour has suddenly kicked in. Let me read you some of them.
This is like a Boaty McBoatface, isn't it?
That's it. Oh, lovely. I hadn't thought of it, but it's Boaty McBoatface. For example, I once saw a pigeon nick a mayonnaise sachet from an old couple on a park bench. The day I moved to London, someone threw a fork at me from an upstairs window as I walked on the street below. I didn't realise at the time, but thanks to an ancient bylaw, it turns out I'm now entitled to have 3 of my sheep marry the offender's firstborn daughter. My favourite. I was advised by an unscrupulous black cab driver to visit a house in Mayfair, lived in by the composer Handel and Jimi Hendrix. Imagine my outrage when it became clear neither still live there, and both are in fact dead. Want a couple more?
I want about 20 more, please.
Saw someone try and join the middle of a queue to join their friend. Luckily, the police were on hand to tot loudly at them until they moved to the rear. Wasn't pretty. Got mugged by a goose in Regent's Park. It hissed at me and stole my BLT sandwich. 2 more. I diligently watched a beef eater for 8 hours while he was on duty, and he didn't eat beef once. I'm starting to suspect the Queen may be fraudulently employing vegetarians. My oat milk coffee the other day was insufficiently textured. I reported the coffee shop to the Shoreditch branch of the Food Standards Agency, and the owner was placed in a giant wicker man on London fields and burnt to death. So I put in one. I heard some bloke whistling in Burlington Arcade last week. I shouted for help, then rang 999, but the Rozzers never came. It wasn't like this in the past, I can tell you. Which brings us, David, which brings us to this week's fact.
Are you about to land on the moon?
Do you know what that is, by the way?
Go on.
It's Fanfare for the Common Man by that group. By Copeland, rather. Right. The fact. The reason I tweeted that to the New York Times as an example of petty crime on the rise is because Burlington Arcade, off Piccadilly in London, built in 1818-1819 by Lord Cavendish, who was the future Earl of Burlington. You're not allowed to whistle there. Did you know that?
Well, this is an example of the London elite telling us northern, us people stuck in St Helens. I can tell you some facts about.
If you can sort of whip up a few, coppers and walk yourself down here. Yeah. Go to Burlington Arcade and try whistling, and the smallest private police force in the world will descend upon you. They are the Burlington Beadles. The original ones were employed by Lord Cavendish to protect the Lord and his wife from pickpockets. He only built the shopping arcade anyway so that she could shop safely amongst the other genteel ladies and gentlemen, away from the busy, dirty and crime-ridden open streets of London. And so he then employed this small police force who to this day are there. Now, you're not allowed to whistle because the pickpockets were in league with the prostitutes, many of whom had rooms at the top of Burlington Arcade, and they used to whistle to warn the pickpockets and the prostitutes that the police were upon them. So you're not allowed to, but there are 2 people, and this is another fact, there are 2 people who can. One is a young East Ender in the 1980s. He was very down on his luck. The Beatles took a shine to him. He was having a pretty hard time, and they said, look, if you go back to school and get a good report, bring it back to us, we will let you whistle in this arcade. He did, and they gave him a little certificate. And the other person is Paul McCartney.
Oh. Wow.
There he was, whistling in the arcade in the 1980s. And someone tapped him on the shoulder and said, "Excuse me, sir, you're not allowed to whistle in here." But when they discovered it was Macca, they said, well, I think we can make an exception for you, Sir Paul, as he probably wasn't at the time. And he's allowed to whistle. So, fact, Paul McCartney can whistle in Burlington Arcade, but fact, you can't.
Can you just do? I'll turn something. I'll do what you normally do, just for the sake of people who live in America and indeed St Helens. What exactly is Burlington Arcade and where is it?
God. Really?
Yeah, I've
it's
never
where
heard
I get
of
my
it.
top hat made, David. Burlington Arcade is, well, there's these lovely, lovely shopping arcades. Look, they've got them in Leeds, for God's sake.
Yeah, it's just like a shop.
Arcades.
It's just like
right. Did I mention Leeds? Yeah. And they are just these very, very high-end, super duper watches that cost $9,000 and jewellery that you wouldn't ever wear, posh cravats, in this beautiful, beautiful 1800s arcade. There's 3 or 4 of them all in the same area.
I think we've got them in Manchester. I've seen these.
They are. Yeah. I doubt that. They are really, really lovely. But it's just a lovely little fact. I mean, come on, if you're, I don't care where you're from.
No, it is. It's just
London
I've never heard of Burlington Arcade. I genuinely hadn't heard of it.
I suspect. I've only just thought this. It might be from where Burlington Bertie's. It was a song, music hall song, I think, called Burlington Bertie, which I shall go look up now. But, David, I will leave you with some whistling. Okay? No. Yeah. This is Gert Chatroux whistling Debussy's Clair de Lune, whoever she is. And
editing this is going to be fun this week.
I reckon if this fella did whistle in Burlington Arcade, I think that he'd be allowed to. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
And good night.
The end is in sight.
The colourful phrase used by a charismatic figure.
This is the Trump shutdown.
Thank you, God bless you, and God bless the nations of the world.